I'm thrilled now to continue with our seventh session on federal contracting overseas. Our presenters are first Robert Nichols, who's the founding partner in Nichols Lew LLP, Addie Cliff, who is a partner at Kroll and Mooring and a member of the steering committee for the firm's government contracts group, and also a member of the International Trade Group. Peter Iyer from Kroll and Mooring is a partner and co-chair of the firm's government contracts group and a member of the firm's management board. And last but certainly not least, our good friend, Professor Chris Eukens, who serves as co-director of the Government Procurement Law Program at George Washington University Law School. Robert, let me turn it over to you to get the panel started.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's move right into the first slide. We're going to be covering today a number of topics in relatively short order. We'll start with overseas compliance. This is something that Peter and I have talked about a good amount. We both work with a lot of contractors that work on behalf of the US government overseas, and that brings certain compliance challenges, and we're going to talk about how companies can meet those. We'll then talk about Section 889 of the 2019 NDAA. This is the Huawei ban that everybody has heard about, but frankly, until this past summer, most companies had not paid much attention to, and it surprised them and has caused a lot of problems. We'll then go into a recently issued DFARS rule on contingency operations. Then Addie will hit on export controls and CFIUS issues. Peter will talk about avoidance of human trafficking and COVID impacts. And then we'll go into some international standards and challenges and efforts from the Biden administration, including the new Buy American Act executive order that just went into place yesterday. So let's jump right into overseas compliance. One of the things that we have learned over the past, I guess, maybe 15, 18 years in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and increased efforts overseas is that local compliance rules can really sneak up on companies and end up in problems both locally in foreign jurisdictions and with regard to the US government contracts themselves. Every contract contains clauses that say you must comply with local laws that apply to you. And this has really been a problem for a number of companies. In Afghanistan and elsewhere, they've dealt with local tax issues that have taken years to resolve. When you get taxed locally, do you have to pay those taxes? Can you pass along those costs to the government? How do you fight taxes that you don't think you should be covering? Labor and employment laws, everything from when you lay off people or you end a contract, do you have to pay them severance? To what happens if they claim that by working more than an 8-hour day, you're actually engaging in some form of human trafficking, to visa requirements, to status of forces agreements and international development agreements that provide certain exemptions, to arrests of contractor personnel, which happens a lot more often than a lot of us would like to see happen, but it seems to happen quite a bit. And one thing that we have done over the past several years, and I know Kroll Mooring has done this a lot, our firm does this a lot with companies, is work as an outsourced resource for finding contractor-focused law firms in different jurisdictions, both law and accounting firms, to act as a conduit, because there's local compliance, and then there's compliance with the contract and US government requirements, and then there's this middle ground to make sure that you are dealing with both appropriately. And so I know that Kroll Mooring and our firm as well, we've developed a very long list of law firms in different jurisdictions around the world who have dealt with US government contractors and NGOs on all of this different range of services. And we often act as a conduit for either making introductions to the right firms or actually overseeing working with local counsel for business registration, visa issues, all of these things. And we think that this centralized service is going to be a continuing trend rather than companies dealing with these things ad hoc, because frankly, it's hard to find local counsel who are always going to be as responsive as you need or in tune to status of forces agreements and other US government requirements. And so I think that you're going to see law firms helping companies more and more have centralized oversight of foreign counsel in these areas. Next slide, please. The next topic I'm going to talk about is the Huawei ban in Section 889 of the NDAA. And as I mentioned, this was enacted a couple of years ago, but it didn't really start to take effect until this past August. And when it did start to take effect, a lot of companies were caught flat-footed. Essentially, what the rule says is government contractors cannot provide banned equipment and services to the US government and cannot even use banned telecommunications equipment and services in performance of a US government contract. And what that means is that companies have to actually figure out whether they have already procured and already are using banned equipment, and if so, they need to get rid of it. And they have to figure out whether in order to perform their contracts, they're relying on other contractors who are using banned equipment and services. And this becomes important because every time you enter into a new contract, you have to actually represent and certify whether you have done reasonable diligence to ensure that you know whether you're relying on this equipment. Let's go through a couple of definitions. The first is a covered entity. Well, even there you have some problems because covered entities are identified by name. You've got Huawei, ZTE, and a handful of other companies, but that list is actually changing all the time. So you actually have to look at a list of covered entities that's put out by the Secretary of Defense, the Office of DNI, and others to see at any given time whether equipment is being manufactured by a prohibited source. What types of equipment? You've got telecommunications and video equipment, but it's essentially equipment that through which information flows that is US government information. And the concern here is, of course, about espionage. As everybody knows, especially from our last panel, US government contractors increasingly are targets of foreign espionage. Well, when the systems themselves the contractors are relying on are the basis for going in and stealing the information that's going through those systems, that's what the US government is trying to focus on. So telecommunications and video equipment, when that equipment is used to route or direct data traffic and permits visibility into the data. So what do you have to do? You have to go in and do, quote, a reasonable inquiry. That means an inquiry designed to uncover the information in your possession about whether your company uses this covered equipment and services, and whether it's in your systems, and not just your government contract systems, anywhere in your company systems, and if so, to eradicate it. Now, this doesn't necessarily flow down to subcontractors. Some parts of it do, some parts of it don't. But what we're seeing, where we're seeing this really come into play, you can move to the next slide, Alan, where we're seeing this really come into play is in a hodgepodge of different regulations that are agency by agency. They're slightly different, but one of the common issues that we're seeing is that companies that are working overseas on behalf of the US government, they inherently need to rely on local telecommunications systems and internet service providers. Well, in some parts of the world, those telecom companies and ISPs are built on backbones full of this prohibited banned equipment. And so what do contractors do if they know that they're relying on these services to perform US government contracts? They can reach out to their local telecom company or ISP to ask whether they are, but they don't really have a choice. Well, what do? You can go on to the next slide, Alan. You have to conduct a reasonable inquiry on the information in your possession with regard to the ISPs, telecom companies, et cetera, and memorialize the inquiry that you've made to determine whether you're relying on this prohibited equipment or services, and be able to certify that you either are not using the equipment or services that rely on that equipment, or if you are, to disclose it. We think that this is going to come up and bite people most often from internal whistleblowers who believe that there's not sufficient diligence going on and that contractors are certifying and making representations without really knowing whether they're relying on this. So this is a tricky issue that we wanted to bring to your attention. Let's move to the next slide. The next topic that I'll just briefly touch on is this new proposed regulatory update that just came into place, I believe, in December on operational contract support. Essentially, DoD has put out guidance on how DoD needs to plan better to integrate contractor capabilities for capabilities and personnel working outside the US. What's the intent? It's to tighten up the system to ensure that DoD contractors are fully prepared to support the US government in a number of different areas. Largely, this involves better planning with contractors for contractor support and better defining what the contractor work is and how it ties into what the government is doing. It broadens the operations within DoD for the areas where contractor support needs to be planned out, but it also puts more clear requirements on contractors with regard to their personnel, for medical and dental requirements, for the support and services that they can provide, and how those personnel need to be tracked. So if you're a contractor that provides operational support to DoD overseas, this is something you're going to want to keep an eye on. Next slide, please. Addie, let's turn to you for export controls and CFIUS.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert. If we could go next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on a number of cross-border national security related issues that come up in the context of government contracting. I'm going to go a little bit rapid fire in the interest of time, trying to cover a lot in a little bit of time, but at least give a flavor of all the different key developments and key considerations in this area, starting with export controls. So export control compliance is an issue for government contractors, whether or not you're performing work overseas, though, I think most people realize when they are performing work overseas that it's something that they need to take into consideration. We have here on the slide some of the common activities that can implicate export controls. So, for example, jurisdictional or classification changes based on modifications made for the government. So you take your commercial platform, you make some tweaks at a customer agency's request. Now all of a sudden you had, software that's not controlled, now it's controlled, or it changes the level of control. Providing services to a foreign person, this can include furnishing services to foreign allies under a contract for the US government, and we'll talk about that a bit. Receiving or releasing controlled data or technology, whether that's in the US or overseas, your employees traveling, carrying devices, they've got their phone, they've got their laptops, they may have controlled data on the devices, and then I guess perhaps the most straightforward, actually shipping controlled items to a third party. I think that's what most people think of when they think of an export, but just really one element of this. There's been a lot of activity in export controls. This is one of the tools in the regulatory tool belt to address these national security concerns. I'm only going to highlight a few. In April of 2020, the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, issued 2 new final rules and a proposed rule that amended the export administration regulations to impose new export licensing requirements on an expanded scope of dual use items when those items are destined for military end use or military end users in China, Russia, and Venezuela, and it removed and modified certain license exceptions. So these changes are really all geared to address national security concerns about civil and military integration, civil military fusion in these countries of concern. The fact that even non-military actors are really collaborating with and helping the military, and to require companies that are dealing with U.S. origin items to perform more diligence when they're dealing with end users, especially in China. And similar to the last panel, we're going to be talking about China a lot in these issues. Relatedly, in December of 2020, so just last month, BIS published a new list called the Military End User List, the MEU list, and that's a positive list of military end users, though BIS has said this list is not exhaustive, so companies still have to perform their own diligence to see if the end users meet the definition of military end user. The MEU list is separate and distinct from the entity list. They're both really trade blacklists, but there's two key distinctions between the two lists. So the MEU rule doesn't apply to all items that are subject to the EAR. It only applies to enumerated items that are listed in the regulations. And the MEU rule only applies to end users or end uses in China, Russia, and Venezuela. The entity use is not geographically limited. So in addition to the MEU list, BIS has also been very active in terms of adding entities to the entity list. So in December, there were 77 new entities that were added, including several high-profile Chinese companies. I think at this point, it's good to mention that there's a separate list that is published by DoD of communist Chinese military companies that are operating directly or indirectly in the U.S. DoD issues that list under Section 1237 of the fiscal year 99 NDAA, so we often refer to it as the Section 1237 list. The Section 1237 list is not the same as MEU list, which is not the same as the entity list. BIS has said that entities that DoD puts on the 1237 list will raise a red flag for exporters as to whether military end users. I also will say here that the Section 1237 list is not the same as the list of covered entities under Section 889, because we see a lot of confusion in that space as well. An entity put on the Section 1237 list would give DoD the predicate, if they want to make it a covered entity, decide in consultation with the Director of National Intelligence that that's appropriate to make them subject to 889. But again, not the same list. So we've got the MEU list, the entity list, the covered entities for purposes of 889, the Section 1237 list. There's a lot of overlapping regimes targeting these Chinese entities. And I think from a practical standpoint, what we're seeing is that companies are having to have a lot of coordination between their global trade compliance team and their government contracts team, and a lot of communication to understand what are the different restrictions and how are they different. Global trade compliance may think that they've got Huawei under control because they've been looking at the BIS, the EAR rules, but they don't really understand that Section 889 is different and broader in certain ways, right? So there has to be a lot of coordination on these points. Moving to another China-related development this year, we had the removal, or last year, sorry, I forget that we're now in 2021, we had the removal of Hong Kong's special treatment for purposes of export controls. So at the direction of President Trump. The effect of this is basically that an export to Hong Kong is treated as an export to China. So this can create significant operational changes for companies that may have relied on Hong Kong's special treatment in the past. And then finally, I guess unrelated to China, just to take a quick break from that, I want to mention another development that dates back to 2019, but we've seen a lot of activity in 2020 and going forward. This was the Department of State's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, DDTC's issuance of a final rule that modifies Exemption 126.4 under the ITAR. So this is a license exemption that authorizes exports in support of the U.S. government. So a very important exemption for those who are doing U.S. government contracting overseas, a critical one. And the rule really clarified and expanded the scope of the exemption. So this particular exemption allows government contractors to provide ITAR-controlled hardware, technical data, defense services to foreign partners without a license when certain circumstances are met. The export or the performance of defense services has to be at the written direction of the cognizant department or agency, and it has to be for one of the enumerated activities, like carrying out a cooperative program and furtherance of certain international agreements. So We've seen that contractors have had a lot of question after the rule was issued about the application, what constitutes rejection, how can contractors confirm that their exports fall within one of the authorized activities. There's been some helpful guidance that has come out from both DITSA and DDTC. Most recently, there's some FAQs that are up on the DDTC website. They are dated May 2020. And I would say anyone who's thinking about this exemption, take a look at those FAQs for additional guidance. Let's flip to the next slide, please. Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to talk about foreign investment and ownership. These issues are not limited to overseas contracting, but they certainly do come up in the overseas contracting context. And I would say they fall more generally into the cross-border bucket that we're focused on here. It's also, related to overseas contracting, not uncommon for U.S. companies and foreign companies to partner for overseas contracting, whether it's through a joint venture, acquisition, investment, and so those types of transactions are going to implicate the foreign investment and ownership considerations that I'm going to be talking about. In terms of foreign investment, foreign ownership, thematically, what we've seen is a focus on transparency and disclosures so that the U.S. government can assess the risk, if any, associated with foreign ownership and investment, a focus on China, and a focus on certain sectors of concern like telecommunications and information technology. So circles back to Section 89 that Robert in the prior panel had talked about. Starting with transparency, the fiscal year 21 NDAA had a couple of provisions requiring that companies report on beneficial ownership. First, targeted at identifying anonymous shell companies, a view towards preventing money laundering, other financial crimes. The Corporate Transparency Act, which was passed as part of the NDAA, has a reporting requirement for corporations that are formed under the law of a foreign country and registered to do business in the U.S., requiring reporting to FinCEN. There is an exemption, given that this is really geared towards shell companies, for entities that meet certain criteria, having 20 full-time employees in the U.S., filing federal income tax returns, and meeting a certain threshold of sales in the U.S., and having an operating or physical presence in the U.S. Separately, Section 85 of the fiscal year 21 NDAA will require contractors and grant recipients to disclose beneficial ownership in a database that will be maintained by GSA, used by contracting officers, suspension and debarment officials. This has not yet been implemented. On the face of the statutory language, at least, it looks like it'll apply to contractors, not lower tier subcontractors, but we're sort of in wait and see mode to see how that gets rolled out. So we can't talk about foreign investment without talking about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which does national security reviews of foreign investment and acquisitions. In 2018, we had the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, that was signed into law. This was very much a response to concerns about China's encouragement of direct investment as a way of achieving technological advancement in certain industries like the semiconductor industry. I've heard this referred to as China's weaponization of investment. FIRMA was passed to close a few perceived gaps. So historically, CFIUS has had authority to review transactions that result in control of a U.S. business by a foreign person, so control. FIRMA gave CFIUS for the first time jurisdiction over certain non-controlling but non-passive investments, and that authority is focused on businesses that have certain activities related to sensitive personal data, critical infrastructure, and critical technology. Critical technology in the CFIUS sense refers basically to export-controlled items, certain export-controlled items. FIRMA also, so CFIUS filing historically had been voluntary, but with the risk that the government would want to open up and look at the transaction and could unwind it down the road. But FIRMA CFIUS filing is mandatory in certain circumstances. And if you fail to go in, you may be subject to penalties up to the value of the transaction. So it's really important to understand when a particular investment or acquisition may trigger a mandatory filing. At a very high level, it's where there's a certain level of foreign government interest in the investment. In certain businesses of concern, goes back to that sensitive personal data, critical infrastructure, critical technology, and acquisitions and certain non-controlling instruments in U.S. businesses that design, develop, manufacture critical technologies. So the regulations that implemented FIRMA, they came out in a series of rulemaking. The last major tranche was published in early 2020. The two key updates that happened this past year is CFIUS finally implemented a rule using filing fees. based on the value of the transaction. And then with respect to the mandatory filings for investments in US businesses that engage in activities related to critical technologies, that had first come out as a pilot program. Pretty quickly after FIRMA was passed, CFIUS revised the trigger for when that mandatory filing is required. It's from one that was based on whether these businesses' activities fell within certain enumerated industries, one that looks instead at whether the release of the technology at issue to the foreign person would require an export license. So in addition to CFIUS overhaul, on January 19th, so just a week ago, or a little over a week ago, Commerce issued an interim rule implementing its new authority, pursuant to an executive order that was issued in 2019 to block or undo any transaction. This includes use, purchases, importations, so we're not an M&A here, this is, we call it mini CFIUS, of virtually any information and communications technology or services, ICT, I'll refer to that, that's designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by persons that are owned by, controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction or direction of a foreign adversary, which includes China and Russia, as you may expect. The rule does provide a description of the scope of covered ICTS transactions. It's very, very broad and captures almost all communications and information technology services that are used in networks, cloud-based systems. The rule does say that Commerce is not going to review ICTS transactions that CFIUS is reviewing or has reviewed, so that's good. Bad news, there's a threshold for review, no de minimis carve-out. Commerce can review the transaction long after consummation. Commerce has said that it's going to provide a licensing process so parties can go and get certainty if they want that with respect to a proposed ICTS transaction. So stay tuned to see how this one plays out. And then finally, given that I've focused on a bunch of restrictions, I think it's nice to add on a more positive note of relieving contractors of certain restrictions. So for cleared companies that are under FOCI mitigation, foreign ownership control or influence mitigation, so a special security agreement to make that foreign ownership, DCSA has authority to waive the requirement to obtain national interest determinations, NIDs, to perform work that requires access to prescribed classified information, where the partner is located in a country that's part of our national technology and industrial base. So that's Canada, Australia, and the UK. I think that I end on that to say that while we're tightening up restrictions related to perceived adversaries like China, we see at least some relief from the restrictions where our closest allies are involved. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Peter.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Addie. And let's go ahead and move right to the next slide. I'm going to touch on two basic issues. The first is human trafficking, and the second, we'll talk about COVID impacts, and in particular, those impacts for overseas contractors. We're going to touch on human trafficking first. It remains a very significant risk area for international contractors. And of course, the overlay of COVID means that there are several new areas of risk, concerns about worker safety and workplace safety. A number of sectors are seeing increased demand for labor, including agriculture, medical manufacturing, mask manufacturing, medical care, transportation, delivery, and leading to a number of concerns about overtime, additional work. And then given COVID considerations, there have been, not surprisingly, fewer site visits, less on-site monitoring. So that raises concerns as well. And then, of course, concerns about heightened vulnerability to becoming victims of human trafficking because of the demand in certain sectors. In 2020, we started to see the impact of guidance issued by OMB in late 2019 related to human trafficking. And let me talk a little bit about why that is and the impacts for contractors and awardees. On the source selection side, agencies have started taking a much more proactive approach to considering CTIP compliance matters as part of past performance evaluation when a contract it is occurring or will occur in a high-risk environment. So increasingly, contractors have to submit information about their CTIP plans and also information about past non-compliances. Contracting officers and specialists within the agency are starting to look at that from a past performance perspective, and in certain cases, from an affirmative responsibility standpoint. We've also seen a bit of a shift in how the government is handling disclosures and indications of actual or potential CTIP violations. As the government and NGO community receive more input from contractors, including disclosures, response to show cause letters, looking at specific plans, meetings with suspension and debarment officials, the government's starting to coalesce around what a functional program looks like. And this is a fairly typical progression where there's a FAR provision, and then the government starts to think about and talk about what a best practice is, what a functional program looks like. So it's important for all of us, for contractors, to start thinking about what those functional requirements would look like, because that's what the government expects. So a few notable examples to call out. So when the FAR talks about requiring certifications, increasingly what the government is looking for is what underlies those certifications. Has there been diligence at high-risk sites? Has there been an assessment of high-risk sites? High-risk suppliers? Was there vetting on the front end? And then what was done in response to complaints? So increasingly what we're seeing is certification goes in, government may say, well, tell me a little bit about the diligence that was conducted, what active monitoring and oversight was conducted. An emerging expectation as well for high-risk suppliers that contractors are actively engaging with those high-risk suppliers about training, validation that subcontractors have programs in place. So in other words, the government starting to put sort of some meat on the bones of those FAR requirements. And we've seen the impact of contractors that don't have those type of programs in place, that the government wants to push harder, and the government wants to really understand how contractors are getting comfortable. So that all flows from the increase in diligence the government's conducted, and it tracks this OMB memo from late 2019, which starts to kind of frame some of the expectations the government has. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to turn now to COVID impacts and considerations more generally as it relates to overseas contracting in the midst of a pandemic. Many of these are not unique to overseas contracting, but some are a bit more pronounced, and in particular because of some of the guidance we're seeing from certain agencies. Virtually every contractor is experiencing COVID impacts. USAID, for example, surveyed its worldwide implementation partners. Not surprisingly, 90% plus indicated significant challenges focused on travel, health, safety, IT capacity. So what does that mean? A couple different things. So USAID and other agencies have issued a lot of guidance, trying to provide flexibility, trying to provide relaxation. But as a result, what we're going to start to see, and have just started to see, is an uptick in question costs, audits, inquiries about how those increased flexibilities were deployed. So consider, for example, a firm fixed price contract or agreement where the contractor didn't fully deliver the services that were contemplated by that statement of work, by that contract. How was it handled? Was notice given? Was a modification issued? Did the contractor still bill for 100% even though less was actually delivered? And it's interesting when you start laying the guidance side by side and starting to look at where the government's going to push from an oversight and audit perspective. This tends to be, or we expect this is going to be, an area where the government's going to look really hard at the guidance that came out of AID, for example, which was changing over time. It was evolving. It varied by region. It varied by type of agreement. And it's a good time for contractors to start taking stock of what they did, what was documented, do they have any gaps, and trying to address those shortfalls now before the audits come. Because when you look at the planning in terms of what is likely to come under the microscope, we would expect that these type of overseas agreements and how those COVID flexibilities were were deployed. That's going to be a big area. And then, of course, as contractors work to recover costs, not just more time, but increased costs, how's the documentation coming together so that those claims and REAs can be supported? And I think that's going to be a major theme this year, and we expect to see additional guidance from agencies on that as well. So I'm going to pass the baton to Chris to talk a little bit about a number of different issues, including BAA. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. So I want to talk a little bit about how the trade policies that my colleagues have been reviewing might play out in the Biden administration. We're beginning to see a first glimmer of that in the first days of the Biden administration with the Buy American order that was issued yesterday. I'm going to be talking about that. I'm also going to be mapping out more broadly a possible way forward for the Biden administration in trade policy. So a starting point is how the Biden administration will approach issues of trade policy and procurement. The nominee for the U.S. Trade Representative will be a very respected staffer from the House Ways and Means Committee, Catherine Tai. And in her speech announcing her prospective nomination for U.S. Trade Representative, she said that she wants to use trade as a force of good. That's a very different approach from the Trump administration's economic nationalism. And it helps us understand where the various measures we'll be going through might play out in the Biden administration. As a backdrop, though, we have to recognize that a core element of the Biden-Harris platform during the campaign was a very strong Made in America policy, informed in many ways by the desire for union support. Union support was a very important part of President Biden's election, especially in the swing states. So there's a dichotomy here. On one hand, Tai says that she wants to use trade as a force of good, but at the same time, the Biden administration has to be very mindful of domestic preferences for domestic preferences, domestic pressure for domestic preferences, largely driven by the union and their substantial voting bloc. So some of the things we've specifically been discussing that Peter and Addie and Robert were discussing, the specific initiatives, in fact, have their own trade ramifications. So I just want to talk about those very quickly. The Huawei ban, the Section 889 ban that Robert talked about in detail, is, if to the extent it's a measure aimed at national security goals to ensure that there is not Chinese penetration, for example, of the U.S. government systems, or that the Chinese are not stealing industrial secrets. Those goals are going to be allowed under Article 3 to the government procurement agreement and similar articles of exception in various trade agreements. So there's no real question but that the United States can take measures like that under the various trade agreements. Section 889 of the Huawei ban, however, goes a step further. And if you look at the background literature, you look at the discussion of why it is that 889 has been undertaken. In fact, the step beyond is to advance the United States position as a premier economic power, essentially to focus on an area where the Chinese could gain an upper hand in telecommunications, and to check that advance so that the United States stays in control, stays in front. That geopolitical goal does not fall within the trade agreement's exceptions. So measures like the Huawei ban that really are about geopolitical jockeying, they may be subject to trade challenge in the future. The cybersecurity maturity model certification is an interesting challenge from a trade perspective because of what it does. And as we know right now, effectively, because of the certification process, it's effectively impossible for most foreign vendors to qualify under the CMMC, which means that as a practical matter, the Defense Department will be locked out from using IT solutions that are produced by foreign vendors. That has strategic implications. It also has trade implications. The CMMC certification standard was put together as a hodgepodge of NIST standards which are very US focused. There are ways to crosswalk that against foreign standards, but there's been really no effort to integrate foreign vendors into the development of the standards or to make the standards something that foreign vendors could access. And that's going to create serious trade barriers. It'll create serious trade issues, both under the government procurement agreement and under the reciprocal defense procurement agreements that the United States has with many allies. So there's going to be likely trade friction coming out of the CMMC, partly because of the way that the certification standards were derived. Separately, there's increasing protectionism abroad, and one of the measures is the European Commission's white paper on leveling the playing field in trade. Under the white paper, which is likely to come to legislative action in the European Union in the next few months in the first quarter of 2021, under the white paper, a foreign vendor that receives a foreign government subsidy could be excluded from a procurement, and in fact could be debarred from future procurements based on what is essentially a second type of protest that could be brought by a competitor, or a second type of challenge, and a long administrative process that could tangle up a foreign vendor, such as an American vendor. Since many American contractors are receiving what are arguably subsidies under COVID-19 relief, there's an open question whether or not American vendors could be very badly hurt by this initiative. A separate issue is with global warming. And as we all know, that President Biden made a central part of his campaign the issue of global warming. He's named a way forward. He's identified a way forward with John Kerry, the former Secretary of State. He's going to be the czar of global warming. And so the question will be, how will this anti-global warming initiative unfold in procurement? Under FAR 23.103, there's already provision for eco-labels, the use of green labels. It calls for green labels on 95% of the products being bought by the government. That could be expanded to 100% and could be made a much more effective provision. If FAR 23.103 were expanded like that, it wouldn't automatically create trade barriers, but it could, depending on whether or not an eco-label is accessible to, let's say, European vendors. A much harder question would be whether or not the Biden administration goes the next step. In 2010, the General Services Administration, in response to the first Obama administration executive order on global warming, the GSA published a report in 2010 which outlined strategies for assessing carbon gas emissions that could be related to any given good or service being bought by the government. So the 2010 GSA report really laid out a game plan for addressing global warming through federal procurement. And if the Biden administration swings back to that game plan, there could be a real question about whether or not these new carbon gas emission requirements are in fact discriminatory and are barriers to vendors from other nations. So the question would be, with all these areas of potential regulatory friction or trade friction, what kind of cooperation will the trade representative undertake? Next slide, please. There's a taxonomy of regulatory cooperation that the OECD has laid out, and I just wanted to flag a few for you. So as the Biden administration moves forward in this area, you can begin to say, oh, this is where the Biden administration is going now. We can begin to see the Biden administration perhaps move up the ladder. The first is, of course, informal exchange and dialogue, and that's likely to occur very soon. That's very easy, for example, for the European Union, the European Commission, and the US government to undertake. Recognition and incorporation of international standards is an interesting question. For example, the NIST standards that undergird the CMMC, will those NIST standards also be crosswalked to ISO standards, the International Standards Organization standards for cybersecurity, so that foreign vendors that follow the ISO standard can also qualify under the CMMC? You could have cooperation between intergovernmental organizations such as the WTO. The WTO has working programs built into the government procurement agreement that will allow for cooperation. We should listen carefully for that occurring. It didn't occur during the Trump administration, but it would be an ideal vehicle for the Biden administration to start using those work programs as a way of facilitating negotiation, facilitating cooperation, not just with the EU, but with other allied nations as well. It's unlikely that there'll be mutual recognition agreements, because that means that regulatory systems are in effect agreeing to adopt their counterparts' regulations abroad. But we might see specific changes to trade agreements. We might see specific changes, for example, to reciprocal defense procurement agreements. It hasn't been done yet, but it's possible that these reciprocal defense procurement agreements between the DoD and ministries of defense abroad could be amended on a wholesale basis in order to accomplish some of these trade reconciliation goals. Next slide, please. So I know I'm short on time. I just very quickly wanted to go through President Biden's executive order from that was on Buy American, and I've got some questions here that I want to leave open for panel discussion as well. And I apologize for this extended presentation, but the executive order came down, and we wanted to make sure that we included it. So the first section of the executive order is essentially a Buy American admonition, which is the same admonition we saw in the April 2017 executive order issued by President Trump. He's telling contracting officers, if at all possible, you should buy American. And the question is, can contracting officers follow that without violating the most basic principle in contract law, which is that the contracting officer in making an award has to follow the terms of the solicitation. So if contracting officers go rogue and start just buying American without following the terms of the solicitation, there could be some interesting questions that arise in possible protests. Section 3 tells agency heads to change their practices, if at all possible, to meet Section 1's goal of buying American, if at all possible. And this raises some real questions, because will the agency heads change longstanding positions that favor free trade? For example, will the Defense Department, will the Secretary of Defense turn back the clock and renege on the reciprocal defense procurement agreements that opened up international defense markets for U.S. exporters? That would have a huge impact on the U.S. industry, because those reciprocal defense procurement agreements with our allies are the pathways for a massive surplus in the U.S. arms exports. Alternatively, would the U.S. trade representatives say, you know what, the Buy American Act waiver that was put in place and pursuant to the Trade Agreements Act back in the 1970s under President Carter, the U.S. trade representative will renege on that. These are possibilities. They're not likely, but they're possibilities, and this raises concerns on the trade front as to how far this will go. Next slide, please. So Section 4 is really about the waiver process, and it's, as President Biden said in his presentation on this executive order, it's an attempt to centralize, consolidate the waiver process under the Buy American Act, really to force individual agencies to come to OMB and essentially beg for a waiver. They want to create an exception process that is extremely difficult for agencies to get through. There's a practical question here, though, doesn't matter, because the Buy American Act only applies between the micro purchase threshold, which is generally about $10,000, and the Trade Agreements Act threshold, which is generally $182,000. It can be lower for specific nations such as Israel, but generally speaking, it's $182,000. So we're only talking about the Buy American Act applying between $10,000 and $182,000. Almost any significant contract goes above 182,000. Any significant supply contract goes above that. So the Buy American Act becomes irrelevant. So all this question about the Buy American Act and waivers may be largely irrelevant. IDIQs typically are held to be above $182,000. The GSA schedules are considered above $182,000. So all the Buy American rhetoric just disappears when you look at exactly how small it is. In a 2018 report, GAO pointed out there's only about $8 or $10 billion, $8 or $10 billion out of a $500 billion budget actually can be subject to the Buy American Act. It's a very small number. Okay. The next in Section 5 calls, if there's a request for a waiver, Section 5 begins to probe as to whether or not the price advantage that's enjoyed by the foreign item is due to a government subsidy. This is exactly the flip of what the European Union is talking about doing under the European Commission's white paper that I discussed before. So you see very interesting development here where the United States, in essence, is looking hard at whether or not there should be some sort of penalty put on foreign subsidies that give foreign vendors a price advantage. Next slide, please. Section 8 calls for a change in the Buy American calculus. We're all used to the component costs, where you look to see whether or not 50% of the components costs in an item, in fact, are traceable to the United States. That price preference would be increased, but more importantly, this is the important part, The Biden administration, President Biden specifically called this out in his presentation yesterday. They want to change the approach. So instead of just looking at the cost of US produced components, they want to look at the value. They want to know whether or not there were jobs created in that value. And it's really not clear how the FAR Council will deal with this. When they have to draft a rule, how will they take into account questions of how many jobs were created with regards to a specific component and specific end item? Okay. Another element is Section 10. Section 10 calls for a hard re-examination of the exception from the Buy American Act for commercial information technology. Commercial information technology is exempted from the Buy American Act under the FAR Part 25 right now. And what Section 10 calls for is a re-examination of that. If that commercial IT exception were eliminated, it would be an administrative explosion because it's very difficult to do a Buy American Act assessment with regards to commercial IT because of the international supply chain, the global supply chain that goes into any given piece of IT. So this could be a really difficult provision to implement. The one way that agencies might try to avoid this, if this went through and there were no longer a Buy American Act exception for commercial IT, agencies might try to push their IT buys into the commercial platforms. The commercial platform contracts were awarded by GSA on June 26th to Amazon Business, Overstock, Fisher Scientific. If agencies were in that gray area of procurement, if they were in between $10,000 and $182,000, and they're buying IT and they're subject to the Buy American Act, agencies might reconsider their strategy and try to drive their procurements down below the micro purchase threshold, make onesie-twosie purchases, small purchases of IT in order to get it below the micro purchase threshold and use those platforms, use the Amazon type platforms. Next slide, please. Okay, Section 11 calls for a report on the use of waivers, and presumably this is about the waivers that are done on a project-by-project, procurement-by-procurement basis, but sometimes can be very long-standing. Those are, it appears to be different than the waivers that under the general waivers under the Trade Agreements Act. Section 12 calls for an assessment of those TAA waivers, the Trade Agreements Act waivers, and just I want to be absolutely clear here. So President Carter in the 1970s, pursuant to the Trade Agreements Act, lent authority to the U.S. Trade Representative to waive the Buy American Act and also the balance of payment programs. But the U.S. Trade Representative waived the Buy American Act for above threshold purchases. So the purchases that are above $182,000, which is the current threshold under the Trade Agreements Act. That waiver presumably would remain in place because this Section 12, Section 12 calls for an assessment, it doesn't call for revoking that waiver. So it appears from Section 12 and the rest of the executive order and from the general principle that we want to use trade as a force of good, that basic waiver of the Buy American Act under the trade agreements, that basic waiver will stay in place, that the overall structure that where procurements that are above $182,000 will not be covered by the Buy American Act, that will remain in place. That appears to be the intention. But I just want to talk about the last step here. Can you just go to the next slide, please? Which were remarks made by the president in in signing the executive order. So first of all, with regards to COVID-19, he says that he wants to continue to do stockpiles. He says he wants to do onshoring. He says he wants to do research and development to build up that onshoring capability. So a lot of these are trajectories that are set by the Trump administration, and President Biden is following that same trajectory. The second part is very interesting. The second quotation here said he said, we'll be committed to working with our trading partners to modernize international trade rules, including those relating to government procurement, to make sure we can all use our taxpayer dollars to spur investment that promotes growth and resilient supply chains. What does this mean? What will he be approaching international partners about? Ironically, the answer may actually be already in Europe. The European Defense Fund allows different member states in the European Union to cooperate in research and development, and the weapon systems that are developed through those cooperative efforts, they in effect have a domestic preference because the part of the package is if two European nations develop a weapon system, that the production of that weapon system will be limited to European companies. Now, the European Union has signaled that perhaps American companies could participate if it has to be a company with a substantial participation in the project and a company from a country that shares, this is very interesting, shares the outlook, shares the ethical and moral outlook of the European Union, which hopefully, presumably, is the United States. So the European Defense Fund calls for protected research and development among European companies, protected production, but the United States may be able to participate from the outside. If the United States follows that model under the Biden administration's apparent policy, it would be possible for us to have combined research and development with our allies and move forward on a protected basis with our allies, excluding third parties from other nations that, for example, don't share common values. So the European Defense Fund would perhaps become a model for what the Biden administration intends to do. Again, I apologize for going on, but this is a very new executive order, and it does clarify the trajectory for the Biden administration. So we thought it'd be worthwhile for me to talk about. Thank you.
Well, Chris and Addie, first of all, thank you very much. I mean, within less than 24 hours to have this kind of preparation and bring us up to date, really yeoman's work, and we really appreciate that. This is an area clearly worth continuing our attention on. Robert and Peter, let me thank you also for the work and the preparation that you did in covering those topics.